So you know why we're here. You've seen the session intro. Obviously, the pace of change in digitization technology is so fast, it's incredibly difficult for even us to keep up with it. There's been so much change in the last 18 months to 2 years that we're all struggling to keep up with it. What we're going to try to do here is look at, take a framework that we've taken from a recent report called the Bit by Bit report, which some of you may have come across. We'll share links to it and show you the report. That looked at 3 guiding principles that business and government can benefit from. We're going to look at that, but also look beyond it, hopefully. The 3 areas that we're going to focus on are what the 3 of the key recommendations. I'm going to speak to start off with a little bit about the need to focus on the mission, what it is that we're actually there to do. Lisa's going to then talk a little bit more about the value of technology in all of this, and then Panos is going to go into the critical bit, which of course is not forgetting the people. So that's the sort of framework that we're going to do, and then we'll have discussions and see where we get to with that as we go along. Okay, so I'll start off with the first of those areas. Have you got that slide of the bit by bit report, just so that we know the one that we're talking about? It's oh no, actually, can you go back to that slide? That was a really nice sort of summary slide, which came from the Bit by Bit report, which really struck us. Technology transformation is not only about the technology, they're about the process and about the people who are benefiting from the services and people who are executing the services. We just felt that was a really nice sort of starting point. And then if you just go on to the, oh no, there was one with the Bit by Bit, it doesn't matter. Well, those, oh yes, those are 2 that we're going to look at. It's the first one that we're talking about here. And then Lisa will talk a little bit more about the second one. So let's look at the first of the 3 recommendations, focus on the mission. I was thinking while I was coming about this and thinking about this thing, I don't know how many of us have got these on our wrist these days. As a 50-something, I'm thinking about keeping myself fit. So why am I at 11:30 and my wife sitting down and going, oh, we haven't finished completed our rings today. I need to go and walk around the block to make sure that I've done all my move for it, completed my move for it. Am I the only person who's ever done that? I think I'm not. I'm thinking my mission, my personal mission there, is to keep myself relatively fit and healthy. But why am I going out at 11:30 to walk like 200 yards around the block? Because that is not part of my mission. I don't have to do that. It's the tech that's making me do it. But I've still got it, and so she, and we still do it. That is just one little example of where my mission is being shaped by, or my actions are being shaped by the available technology. And it's those kind of things that sometimes we find ourselves falling into doing. We want to explore those a little bit more. If we look at our mission as security managers, because that's what we're here for, rather than thinking about our fitness watches. Obviously, security risk management, it's an approach which enables access and impact for crisis-affected populations. What we should be doing in that process is going right through the cycle we all know so well, looking at the context, looking at the needs analysis, and designing our response informed by that. But, as I said at the outset, I work for a very small NGO, and we don't have the funds to design the right response for every situation that we find ourselves in. We may have a license to use one thing that we thought was actually the right solution for a program that we had running, say, 3 years ago, and that license is still there. We don't have the funds to go out and actually find the right one. So we found ourselves adapting because we have to, and we're proud to be using our funds effectively. In fact, it's part of our mission is to use our hard-won donor funds effectively. And as a result, we can end up with the wrong tools. Actually, sometimes in my consultancy work, I find myself working, again, with smaller NGOs, and I find myself making assumptions about their technological abilities, maybe even their access to signal or electricity, or who knows, so that I'm misinterpreting or making suggestions to them, or even leading them in the wrong direction on the basis of their my perceptions about what they're able to do. So funds is right. Of course, we've got the context of the post-COVID world as well. Our focus has changed. We know that we're in a new normal. We know that Lisa, even though she couldn't join us, is just able to join us suddenly. The technology is enabling us to do so much more. But have we, again, got the right tech? It may be that actually this setup is not as complicated as it needs to be. It may be that sometimes the technology that we've got, even that license that's 3 years old, we didn't need that in the first place. We're actually still able to look back and go back to what we were using this technology 3 years ago, or 4 years ago, or 5 years ago. Some of my best solutions that we've operated at our small NGO have been those no-tech solutions, not thinking through actually do without necessarily overcomplicating. I just wanted to give 3 little live examples that struck me that may be relevant. As I mentioned, I work for a small organisation. It's a volunteer-based organisation called Rally International, and we are going through various processes of updating our systems at the moment. Our IT expert is brilliant because he gets us to play with solutions, but holds us back and ensures that we don't go too far without his guidance, because he understands actually what the pros and cons of each opportunity are. And I think the temptation at the moment is for us all to play a little bit too much sometimes, and to actually go too far down a procurement process without actually getting the expertise that we need involved. So in SRM solutions, I can't imagine how many times I've been presented with mobile tracker solutions that actually aren't quite right for my organisation. And I've, and therefore it's really important to go back to the needs. What is it my organisation needs? It's quite different from others. In the consultancy work that I talked about, the second case study, where I'm providing support to local NGOs, very often they're coming to me and saying, well, actually what we need to do is really quite elaborate risk assessment processes, and they know what they need to do, but they're jumping ahead a little bit because they actually need to go through the underpinning process of building those processes, building their policies, understanding what their risk appetite is before leaping in to actually doing the risk assessments. So it's about ensuring that we're doing things at the right level. It's not necessarily using technology. There are great solutions out there, and I'm involved with one of them that I'll talk about briefly in a minute, but they're not necessarily the right ones. And I think this is at the heart of the localization debate, getting the right basic systems, policies, processes to build an organization's ability, rather than unnecessary complex stuff. The little example I wanted to give is more in my area of risk analysis and geopolitical risk analysis. We want the best, most informed systems that support our organization's vulnerability profile, and that provides the protection and the access that we are all required to do. I've been involved very closely with Insecurity Insight, who are also not here in the room today, but are also here, and a tech company called Forksight, to develop for the sector, by the sector initiative. We've been developing it over the last couple of years, pushed by that network that I chair. And it's bringing together relevant data, predictive geopolitical analysis, and the tech visualization side. We call it the Vigil Insight Initiative. You may have seen it through some H2H initiatives on Ethiopia recently, on Haiti, where we've been building a community of security practitioners and getting them in virtual rooms together to actually share experience, but also we've been able to present back relevant reporting for the sector. And what this is doing is bringing together the high-tech side, but also the simple bringing people together using the technology we've got. So simplicity and complexity is not everything. Simplicity, the old school, bringing people together, getting analysts in is also absolutely critical. We've been doing other work, if anybody's interested, in Myanmar, DRC, Nigeria, Mozambique, A lot, it's all available online if anybody wants to look at it. Do, you know, follow me on LinkedIn and access to it. So in conclusion, all I'm really trying to focus on is the mission. We need to be going back to the mission, thinking, what is it that we're actually trying to do? How are we going to protect it? How are we going to provide access? What tech do we need? Are we unwittingly imposing wrong solutions? And is there anything we can do to take that step back, or are we constrained? We're not always able to, but we need to be aware that this is directing us a little bit. If anybody knows about fitness tracker, I can use that. Thank you very much. That's an introduction to my bit of it, the first part of the bit-by-bit recommendations. I'm now going to hand over to Lisa, who's going to talk about second.
Thanks for that. And I will do, oops, I'll turn camera on first. And I just didn't want to distract, so thanks for that. One thing I'm going to pick up on something that David just said, which is actually really interesting when we do come to technology, and it's quite relevant in terms of digital security, is that we also do know that, for example, we're just talking about updates to software and so forth. It's one of the pathway mechanisms that we do find are issues for cybersecurity, and the malicious actors and the nation state actors actually hone in on those areas of software that aren't continually kept up to date. So it's an important thing to remember that with all our devices, and there's something like, the figure is something like 20 billion or 27 billion devices connected to the internet as we stand at the moment. But one of the things that's critically important is when we don't actually update software and keep those devices up to date, the kit, as we call it, or the devices that are out there, become a central focus and a point for digital security issues and cybersecurity issues. So there's one big tip out of today, is just to make sure that you do keep those devices up to date. So let me just go full screen. Hang on 2 secs. There we go. And you've got to love technology. And really, although it's been a bit of a disaster the last couple of days for me, and really difficult, I think even the fact that I am able to do this is indicative in many ways of showing the value of technology for the humanitarian sector, particularly in terms of risk management, because we have to recognise that, 2.5, 3 years ago, we didn't do this. Whereas now there are situations that may previously have been extremely high risk or rated as high risk, and we can now do these virtual engagements. So just this conversation around, virtual technologies and doing what we're doing, if nothing else, shows the value of technology in many ways. So I'm going to sort of take a bit of a twist on this topic, and I'm going to rethink the mission and the delivery of technological solutions and innovation in the humanitarian sector. So I'm sort of going to show the value of the technology, but also talk about some of the risks and the challenges that can be. And as David touched on, I do quite love this image. Showing the value of technology for someone like me can be almost like a vertical learning curve or a cliff edge. So there's some people that are like clambering up the cliff and going, yep, I can do this, and I'm on the journey. And others are standing like on the top edge of the Grand Canyon thinking, oh my God, that's an abyss I'm about to jump into. I'm petrified. And if you feel like that, I feel like that many days, because I too am in this same journey with you. That if you think about the last 2 years, we've had 21 years of digital change in 2 years. But if you actually expand that out to include governments, boards, and the humanitarian sector, you've actually had 40 years of change digitally in that time. And so, this really is a vertical learning curve. It's not just exponential, it's vertical. We went from one thing to overnight. And so don't feel like you're alone. I think that's the other really important concept. If you're struggling with the concept of technologies and how can I use it, what do I need to do with it, the fear of it, and the unknown, you are not alone. The whole world is like that, even experts like myself. In fact, I had a conversation with somebody the other day that they wanted to use a new piece of technology, and I went, I just can't do it. It was actually Teams of all. I know how to use Teams, but I don't use it all the time. I prefer to use other things. And I just went, no, I've got like one day, I just can't do it. My head's an overload. So don't think that you are alone. I think that's the key point. But the technology that when we introduce it, it's got to have value. It's also got to be fit for purpose. And it's really important to remember that technology can certainly allow humanitarian agencies to reach a larger number of people. I mean, clearly, when you look at these virtual events, not everybody can be in a place and previously missed out. So, and of course, that translates also to the services that we might provide to the clients and the customers that we serve and the communities that we work in. Some of our services can be seamless, more seamless, and we can reduce the burden on employees through sort of some of those mindless tasks that we don't want to do. So technology, enables those, and they're fairly, mainstream. But what's interesting is that new and emerging technologies have the potential for what we would call a paradigm shift. This is a whole new world almost. And I'm not talking about the metaverse. I'm just talking, 3D verge. I'm just talking where we sit now, where we can actually go from reaction and reacting to things that we need to do to anticipation, because we can use data and AI, and I'll talk about that in a minute, to enable, better decision making. It can be earlier, faster decisions, and potentially much more effective humanitarian action, particularly in the responses after, natural disasters and other disasters. We can use the technology to help us in our decision making that we previously couldn't do before. But organisations should also evaluate, and this is an important point, not only how to use technology to mimic what we've done in the past and all the activities that we do, not just to replace it, but this is an important point when you're making your assessments. You also need to complement the experience, fill in the gaps that you didn't have before, make it a more enjoyable, more value-added experience. Because if you're only using technology for technology's sake, but you're not actually adding any value to either the organisation or the customers or the community that we work in, or improving security risk management, then it may not be the answer. So it's always important, and that also, technology may be the answer, but you need to find the right technology to improve service delivery. There's nothing worse, and I'm sure we've all experienced it, and government sites are renowned for it being absolutely not user-friendly and intuitive. So that doesn't add anything to use or the value of that technology. And so technology has got to be, work for the greater good. It's got to work for everyone. And I think that's important to remember. Go back to that initial quote that David had there about, it's not just the process, it's the people that you're delivering to and the services, the people who execute the services as well. So you need to think about everyone. But in terms of some of the use cases, artificial intelligence and machine learning, which really I think is quite interesting because it's actually not intelligence. We've actually put the information in there, but it's gathering massive amounts of databases and consuming data like we can't humanly do in the time that we need to do. But artificial intelligence can certainly facilitate and analyse and interpret vast complex humanitarian data sets. It can improve projections. As I said, it can turn us from being reactionary to anticipatory, so we can actually improve our decision making and so forth. Things like mobile applications, chatbots and social media can create immediate feedback loops with people affected by humanitarian crisis. And I'll give an example here, which is very personal to me. In Australia, I am from Ballina, and for those who may or may not know, Ballina and the town right, or the city right beside that, Lismore, in the last 8 weeks experienced the worst flooding in history, and it's completely decimated an entire city of 60,000 people. My elderly parents live in Ballina. Never before and ever in history has it flooded, and it flooded like a major flood. They lost levee banks and all sorts of other things. The thing and the only way that they could communicate with those people to get services, rescue people, communicate what was happening was in fact through the social media outlets such as Facebook, texting, messaging and so forth, because the power in the houses were out, but they did have in the evacuation centres, they had generators and so forth that people could charge their phone. It was the only way that people could communicate, and they could get they could lodge to get emergency payments and so forth. So those, we probably underestimate the value of those for creating immediate feedback loops and getting information to people. Unmanned aerial vehicles or drones, and certainly remote sensing can do a number of things, can mitigate risk because we can send those into areas where the risk for individuals and humans to go is too high. So it can speed up our assessment and mapping and monitoring of vulnerabilities, whether it's after, during, or for reconnaissance work and so forth. Digital cash, and I'm not just talking about digital currencies, can provide rapid and flexible assistance, the way we can actually get money in and out. I mean, I'll use again the example of my parents in the flood. The government was giving, grants of like $1,000 in the first week. The only way they can physically do that is to have digital money. And then many times it was digital transactions of groceries and food and what have you as well. So the use of digital means of exchanging value, not just money, is critically important. And yes, digital currencies and cryptocurrencies are going to be key. And of course, over the last 3 years, we've had many of the big UN organisations have moved, for example, to taking charitable payments and moving payments around using cryptocurrencies because of the evidentiary trail that is produced from them. And of course, that can reduce things like money laundering and malicious actors using funds inappropriately. And the other one that I use here as an example is biometrics. And biometrics, of course, can establish a digital identity and reconnect families. But biometrics, and again, I'll use an example of a colleague who was first on ground after the tsunami in Banda Aceh in Indonesia a number of years ago. And when they arrived, they got a lot of criticism, the humanitarian organisations, like, well, why weren't they working quicker? Why weren't they replacing people and identifying, who they were and getting rebuilding, so forth? And they went, the problem we've got is all the records were also lost because the records were in physical buildings and in physical places and were paper-driven records. So whilst you may think, oh, didn't think about that, it's the fact that how do you know what square piece of land is yours? There was no buildings and no fencing and no marking. No one had any idea of even a perception of space. The fact that those records can now be moved into digital, like cadastral or land registers, is quite profound. But the biometrics also allows us to help identify people that have been lost and killed in massive disasters and so forth. And tied to that, though, is, of course, the challenges we have with digital identity and the fact that the humanitarian sector is actually a target because of the volume of digital identities from areas where there is often conflict, and that can actually be a pathway for digital risk as well. So it's very important, again, that our security measures are kept up to date and accurate. But I think it's important also to talk about the environment. The fact that the pandemic and the degree of change that we've had has exacerbated not only the degree of technological change, but also our attitudes to it. So it's provided organisations with an environment that we can take advantage of, that people are more receptive to change and expecting of change to introduce technology to help us in operations, which previously before we might have had some resistance to. And again, I'll use the example of my elderly parents, 86 and 87, with dementia. And prior to COVID and not being able to communicate with family and friends and go places like they normally would, they were extremely resistive to even having a FaceTime conversation. Now they're old hat, they're ringing me and so forth. So again, the attitudes and the perceptions that we have is something we can actually, if we do it right, we can't take advantage of them in a bad way, but we can use that increased receptiveness to change to our advantage to introduce change that we may not have been able to do easily before. And I always add a big but. The digital divide must be narrowed for any equitable service delivery, and education is key to this. So again, it's work for the greater good. If you bring in technology and the education to use that technology or understand its power, then that's critical. And I think this is really relevant. Less than 3% of our senior academics, our government decision makers, our board members, the ones on our humanitarian organisations, have science and technology expertise, and less than 1% of that 3% have knowledge of blockchain. And when I talk about blockchain, by the way, I don't just mean the blockchain. I'm talking about artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, the data that drives it, the features of it, the evidentiary trails, and all the things that run on it, such as smart contracts. They're just contracts that are going to happen automatically, digital currencies and so forth. It's not nice to know. It's actually foundational technology of the 21st century, as is the internet of the 1990s and moving forward. Now, that means that next slide, that means if these people don't understand, they can't participate. But more importantly, these people are leading organisations and running governments, and they're certainly managing risk. And if you don't understand, you can't make good decisions. And so this is really, really key. It's a time where we can't just say, throw your hands in the air and say, I don't want to know. You have to be able to embrace and learn about what you need to know, or go and find people to help you understand. And key to that for me is education. But secondly, it's simplification to make accessibility much easier for everybody to understand. And so anybody that's ever heard me talk about blockchain, for example, I don't talk about how the technical stuff works. I talk about what it will do for you, the same as when I buy a phone. There we go. When I buy a phone, how many of us buy a telephone these days to make a phone call? We just make the assumption that this little device that we carry will actually make a phone call. Imagine if it didn't. Imagine we bought an iPhone and all of a sudden they've gone, well, nobody ever uses it to make a phone call. We'll just use WhatsApp and messaging services. So we'll just sell you a device. But I buy my device on what it can do for me. So if you're thinking about technology, you need to think about what it will do for you, your customers, and of course, your organisations. And nearly there. I like this slide because, again, I think the facts versus the fiction is important. And what the second of the bit-by-bit reports that I've given you a link for, one was done by the government during COVID and the lessons they learned. The second one, which has only just been released in April, is an article about financing terrorism. And what it's done is it's taken some of the concepts from the first report and said that some of those concepts were based on misinformation and fear. And again, some of those decision makers that I just spoke about didn't have the facts and have misinformed in many ways and created a fear that doesn't exist. So I asked the question, are we actually grappling with the technology? In this case, I've just used the blockchain and all the things that I just spoke about. Or are we grappling with the people using it? Because keep remembering, the technology doesn't produce itself, we do. And this is really critically key. So let's just say machine learning and artificial intelligence is actually not intelligent. We are. It's just a process. It's a process-driven algorithm that we actually create. Data, it's not actually harmful, but how we use it might be. So the data itself doesn't harm anyone. It's how we and what we do with it might be. So we need to think about that. Cryptocurrency and digital assets, they don't facilitate fraud and crime. People do. And crypto fraud doesn't exist. It's just fraud. It's just, you don't hear fiat fraud or people fraud or drug fraud or any of those. And so anti-money laundering and money laundering, I should say, did not start with cryptocurrency. It started hundreds of years ago, and they used many other things like cash, and cash is still king in terms of lack of evidentiary trail. Digital technology, it doesn't redefine our ethics and our values and our morality and our customer service. We do. Technology doesn't. And the whole concept of blockchain, digital assets, the metaverse, digitization, that whole concept, it doesn't redefine right and wrong and what we need to do to address our organisations. Again, we do. It comes to the, it's very much so the people. So I think they're just important concepts to understand. And I'm going to finish on these two slides. And this is an amazingly powerful image. The facts versus the fiction, the fiction, and not knowing about technological opportunity is actually also a risk. We call it an opportunity risk. So in other words, if you miss out on using technology through fear, misinformation, not being informed, it really is like looking at a black and white picture when the world is actually full of colour. You're actually missing a lot. And that's a really good way to think about it, because the next image is the same image, and look at the difference that it makes. Through education, through accessibility, and making really good, careful assessments about the types of technologies that might empower your organisation, and thinking, what do I want it to do rather than what technology is out there? And then when you find a piece of technology or potential, go and learn about it or find people that can help you with it. People make it work. Technology doesn't make it work. We make it work. And so, you know, I just think the difference between that, the facts versus the fiction, and not knowing, you're only seeing half the view. With the information, education, accessibility, you get the magnificent view at the end. So there's a nice way to finish up. And I did promise I wouldn't make it too techie, which I could, but I hope that was helpful. And I know it will now lead on to Panos' section, the final section before we go into the group work and the Q&A. So thanks, everyone. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Lisa. And thank you, David. So I'm going to ground my presentation on my past experience as country director for the IRC and ACF over the last 10 years. And also with my current capacity as deputy director for the Global Intelligence Security Forum. So I've been asked to talk about the people, and I'm going to give you 4 examples of how and why the SRM sector should take into account and think about the people when we introduce new technologies and innovations. So when we talk about people, what comes to my mind is 2 main groups. The first one is the communities we serve, and the second one is our own staff. But let me start with the second one, because I find it a bit easier for me to relate when it comes to SRM, and we can debate about the communities we serve as we go along. First example I want to bring is about what has become very common nowadays in our sector, which is software databases for security, for the management of security incidents. So over the last couple of years, I've seen for the NGOs that I've worked for, but also from other colleagues, that there has been a proliferation of internal software developed by NGOs to manage security incidents. And that's great, because it has been identified by the sector as a gap. Finally, our field staff, which for years have been filling in paper forms, actually they don't have to deal with a black hole whereby you put information and nothing comes out on the other side. So in that sense, it works as an incentive for own staff to finally report security incidents, and for SRM professionals, they're able to visualize data, aggregate data, and when they escalate with senior management, have a tool to help them for data-driven decision making. But again, reflecting on my own experience, you know, these databases are as good as the data you put in them. And when we introduced, for the NGO that I work for most recently in Ethiopia, for the last 3 years, when we introduced these new databases at global level, there was a great push to persuade field coordinators and area managers to make sure that within like 24 hours or less, you had all the security incidents on the database. So the risk here is to put the focus on the process and put the less emphasis on actually having an after the briefings and sit down with the staff and the review that has to take place, putting the emphasis again on the people rather than the database itself. The other example is from the recent GISF forum that we ran in March, and it's on 360 virtual and augmented reality technologies that are used for training capacities, for training purposes, sorry. During the forum, we invited 2 companies. One was American, it's called Headset, and the other one is British, it's called Silk Road. The first one was using high-end VR technologies based on metaverse. So we talk about a couple of thousands of dollars for each device. So probably not a good solution if you want to go at scale with your thousands of staff on the ground. The other one is using cardboard-made VR, very cheap technologies. You take your smartphone, you put it inside, you go through the scenario, and then again, it's meant to be like a low-tech technology that you can go at scale and replicate in many countries. But what I found, and I think Mark, you were there, is that it took like at least 5 to 10 minutes to get used to the new environment. And even when I got used to this virtual environment, I don't think that the experience was good enough from a capacity building point of view, from a training perspective. And I'm not suggesting here that we should not engage with these companies. Actually, we are trying to get them as a business partner, and we're very proud for that. And we want them there to, over the next few months and years, to talk about the industry and what is happening from a technological point of view, because we can't keep up with all the new tools they provide. But it's all about making sure that when it comes to capacity building, the experience is positive and has a positive outcome from an SRM perspective. So we had like 2 different scenarios. One was like active shooting, and you would move your head and you would see like different corners in the room, and then you could make a decision and go left. If you go left, you had scenario A. If you go right, you have scenario B. The other technology was like a more sophisticated. It was a hurricane, and you were holding a joystick, and you had to take like a virtual, make a virtual assessment of the situation on the ground. Brilliant ideas, but from a practical point of view, we struggled during the demonstration session. So again, it goes back to the people. Some of our staff may not be so familiar with these technologies, even ourselves, who are meant to have access to these like advanced technologies. I felt like we're out of our depth. The third example is data mining and big data. Again, most recently, we brought on board an American company called Factal. They broke out of ABS. It's a bunch of former journalists, and what they do is they use artificial intelligence. They aggregate, they collect global data in real time, and they have moderators in their team, and they triangulate all the information. So if you are, let's say, in Juba, South Sudan, or you are in Jijiga, the capital of Somali region in Ethiopia, and you have the app on your phone, you can ask your phone whenever there is an incident within 10 miles from, you said the radius, from your hotel, you can get a real-time notification, and it's actually a good tool also in terms of misinformation as well. However, these tools are designed for corporate environments. So everything is delivered in English. There is no provision for local languages. So it's excellent for if you're an expert or if you are like a staff that is like fluent in English. But for some of our local staff, these technologies are not that useful, to be honest. Though it's a great tool, and I recommend that you subscribe if you have an option. The last example, it may be less relevant, but I think it's worth mentioning. It is about hardware, because most of the technology is about software. In this case, it's purely hardware, and it did happen to me during the scaling up into Gray last year for my operation. So I had the emergency team and someone coming from the US, and he came with a GPS supported device that could provide geolocation offline, and in real time we can know where this colleague was at a given point in time, which is great for that particular context. But my concern and our concern was that it can create a false sense of security, because he did believe that no matter where he is, we could actually track him and know his location on the mountains around Abyei Ali. So again, it goes back to, I'm not saying we shouldn't. It was a great thing to have. It was also a new thing for my mission. We're not like familiar with this kind of technology, but there was always a risk that this kind of technology can create other types of risky situations for the people on the ground. So these are 4 examples about our staff. So when it comes to the communities we serve, I really struggle to find examples from an SRM point of view that can be relevant. So Lisa, she talked about cash transfer. So there are other sectors in our industry, WASH, like more technical sections that they have like, they're more exposed to new technologies. But what I would say that is from an SRM point of view, the underlying principle, and it's a no-brainer here, it has to be the no harm principle. So no matter what we do, we have to keep that in mind. So if we are to bring like a satellite phone in a given location, and we know that that might put in trouble some of our local community representatives, then just don't do that. So just try to find another solution. But I'll be happy to debate that during the breakout rooms. If you have any examples of how SRM technology was a problem for the communities, I'll be happy to document it and also like move it forward as a case study. That's all from me. So back to you, David. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So we've sort of set the scene from our perspective. We'd love to have an opportunity now to split into groups and have a discussion and give everybody an opportunity to share. So I think we're probably going to do 2 groups. Is that right? So I think with the numbers that we've got, and I will focus with half of us on the mission and the tech, and thinking about what's where the challenges are there and how to get it right. And I also think you're going to focus a little bit more on the people and the tech.
That's correct.
How should we do it? Should we sort of literally do it in the areas
that
we've got?
Guys, it's rather informal. We can just stand, just stretch your arms and legs. Whoever wants to stay can stay. Whoever wants to go to the bathroom, go to the bathroom or leave. But the idea is, to have like an informal conversation. Our objective, at least as GSF, is to take some of the conversations to the next level, which is to discuss it with our members and see what is relevant and makes sense for you guys as GSF to discussing some of the upcoming roundtables and webinars that we run. So we can just like.
So if I head over here and you head over to that corner, and people can borrow my pen back. Oh, yeah. One other thing. Generally, did you manage to get people's names?
Yeah,
you did. Okay, that's fine. So we'll start off. So come over this direction if you want to sort of focus more on the vision. We can spend about 15 minutes on this, and then come back with a bit of a sort of point of review. A bit of appropriate technology going on with Panos over there. Go on then. We love a good flip chart.
And I'll just sit here and look over you all, and I'll just go and make a coffee, shall I?
Coffee. That's no. Have you got any? Oh yeah, thank you very much. So come over here.
Nice to meet you. Yeah.
Sorry, hello.
Yeah.
Have we met before?
Make sure that we have some sweet baby so he doesn't feel alone.
Oh, you see, I'm not.
Yeah.
He's not alone.
Okay. Would you like to? So we have Mark from USAID. We have Sharon from UNICEF. We have
come over here.
Trevor from CRS.
Yeah,
and from the French NGO. All right, so we do have some questions for the presentation, but never mind. So I just want to open the conversation again and start from the end. If you do have examples whereby any technology that we introduce.
Some sort of thoughts.
I don't know if you have any examples, case studies, any lessons.
First of all, I don't know, on the sort of mission, super high level ones, where we are. That's what's created in artificial and this question of what is this information especially recently the US government where they have suspicion of headquarters versus people for NGOs. But a headquarters demands information that doesn't use. And that demand field that's dealing with a crisis problem. So I don't know if that's
relevant, yeah.
And it's so frequently about technologies and business process. Okay.
to know people are getting into the law. Silent seekers. You know, if you look, for example, there's been a lot of talk about do you use mobile device information to see how people are moving, and then can you use aggregate data, but you have to make sure that you're not trying to individual people. And so they've got a project right now with which is a Swedish organization, I think. What they take aggregate data on mobile devices. Yeah. And they were using it to figure out how people were moving and how the pandemic was, like how movements were affecting the pandemic in specific countries.
Yeah.
So that was concept of more and more asking questions for questions' sake, but not thinking about are you the person who's responding at risk, putting our numerator at risk, how is this data stored to make sure that we're not putting that person at risk if they disclose an incident and then someone writes on a piece of paper and then that piece of paper gets taken. Whether or not you can triangulate a specific incident, maybe you don't put someone's name, but you say a woman with 2 children in this village. So figure out how this.
Then you have the whole case of the Ringgits. Yeah, what's his name?
We can apply that our attention space, our technology space. We want to apply that in the reality of what our technology is. Whenever and question. So like I know how like collaboration Western institutions that can be provide so you know that's private sector or by organization. That kind of not anonymous, but you know, you'd like to know what centralized, what the opportunities are, because there are a lot of opportunities from the government
how unsatisfactory it was. We totally agreed with the previous talks, and I noted that it is possible that it gets better, but then it would use a lot of energy, and it would require high computing, high-speed computing in order to make things more realistic for the experience to bring something, and that takes a lot of energy and a lot of hardware, so it becomes expensive. It uses resources, so there will be some sort of cutoff there. The government has no consistent approach across countries, so we need to have a better collaboration to find the best solutions. We had somebody express that they would like to know what they can do, what is available out there with technology, what can be done. And that would be also sort of spread around the world in the humanitarian environment, which would bring, you know, I noted a standardization question of how it would be used everywhere. And then digital security is a massive issue. The online voting security was raised from a Swedish point of view, and also cybersecurity when it comes to local. If everything is digitalized, then if there is an issue, then it touches everything. There was an example of grocery stores that had to close down for 4 days in Sweden. Yeah. The ICRC had also cybersecurity issues. So then there's a problem with trusting the systems and providing the information when these things happen. Yeah, we also noted that we should try to have a parallel backup plan that is non-digital for the case that something goes awry in every function that we have. All right. Did I forget?
No, that's lovely feedback. I think on that last one, that no tech backup, I think we also noted that it's really important to have staff trained to sometimes be able to cope with those situations. We've all had situations recently where we have lost access to the essential systems that we've had set up. And so we need to think about our response. Lovely feedback. Thanks, Alev. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, David. I'm going to use the stand, so I don't need you, David, but you were wonderful there. Yeah, I'll try to push it to the middle.
You do need me. You do need me.
Well, I do need you. We always need you.
That's better. Now I can read it.
A couple of points made in our group. First, Mark talked about artificial demand for information, like HQ driven demand that nobody knows what exactly is used for. Is it really necessary, or we just aggregating data for the sake of it? And it can be a burden, especially for the field teams, for those who operate on the ground and have like multiple hats. They try to run the operations. It can really be additional work and probably unnecessary. And the most critical part here is that it's not fixing a business problem. So I think that was the summary of your point, and I think it's a great one. Then we moved to more like ethical concerns around how to deal with the data that we collect and aggregate. So there was an example given by Shannon about a project, a UNICEF and IOM project that is using mobile data to track the movement of people. So again, how is data stored? And what was underscored is that the data is there. It's not going to disappear. So there's always a risk for data to be leaked, to be sold, to be used for other purposes. The other point made was about Western techs selling data, and that's actually the backbone of their business model. So we talk a lot about neocolonialism. We talk about a lot how to break this cycle in the humanitarian aid, but eventually we come back with exactly the same practices from a different angle, and we impose Western technologies that they have a for-profit model that is impossible for NGOs to influence, and therefore there is an incentive for these companies to work with us because they benefit from the data we feed the system with. Trying to address the issue of how to educate communities, there was a very interesting point made by Shannon. Do they actually have an option? So we're talking about the extremely vulnerable people who don't have a good understanding of what it means, data protection, what it means to give your data to an NGO or a tech company, and they don't share the same understanding as we do. We don't have the same sensitivities probably, and it comes out of probably a knowledge gap. So yes, we can talk about it. We can try to educate them. Mark talked about the consent forms, which are great, but again, the question that you asked is that really the solution? Because again, do you really know what you're signing when you give up your data? Again, we circled back and we agreed that we are both the victims and the perpetrators. And that's a problem because we are the victims here in the countries where we live. So we sign up on Instagram, we may have Facebook, WhatsApp, name it, but at the same time, while we're aware about the problem, we do exactly the same in our operations, and then we become, in a way, the perpetrators. We need you again.
If I can just jump in on a couple of those points. Can you hear me? Yep.
Yes, yes, Lisa, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say some great points, and you can continue on, but just some great points. A couple of things that's really important when you are talking about, you know, some of the commercial applications that we use, such as WhatsApp and Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and all of those things, even LinkedIn and so forth. An interesting thing that I always tell most people, that if an application is free, you are the product. So in other words, it's something to remember. If you're not paying for an application, they're making money somehow, and it's always you. You are the product. And I think it's a good basic rule. Even your encrypted end-to-end applications like WhatsApp and so forth are actually still selling the data. And I think there's an important element to this discussion is there is a vast misunderstanding of what personalized and what anonymized data is, and also what can potentially be harmful data use as opposed to non-harmful use. And I'll give you an example. On WhatsApp, you may not be aware that they actually sold WhatsApp to Facebook purely for locationing data. And also from there, it's evolved to things like your predictive texting. Every time you type a message and delete a message, or you correct a message that was incorrectly spelt or whatever, that data, those pixels of data, those elements and remnants are sold 1 million times over. So people will say, yes, but that my application is end-to-end encrypted. Yes, it is. But the data that's going through there and the way you utilize that is not. And that's how they generate their revenues. But I think there's an important part to this that we don't all need to fear. In fact, I led a debate at Strathclyde University in Scotland about a month ago. And I agreed to do it before I was told that I was on the opposite side, saying, and the topic was that privacy is a human right. So I thought, oh boy, how am I going to argue this one? And because you're absolutely correct, data privacy is a human right. The most precious thing anyone can have in any community, in any environment, is themselves, their health data, themselves, their identity, who they are as an individual, and who we give that information to. It is a human right. But I flipped it around, and you need to all think about this. Privacy in that regard is also a naive expectation, because from the moment we're born, every single one of us in most environments, in fact, probably 99% of the environments in which we all live, have given our identity data to someone else from the moment we are born. And think about it like this. We've actually, as individuals, given our identity to our parents without any repercussions for getting that back at any point. So it was an interesting conversation to have. But I think the fact that we do misinterpret sometimes the types of information that are harmful is really important. But you are also very correct. The humanitarian sector, because of locationing data sometimes and identity data, does make that data critically important to maintain. But there's a back end to that as well. And that goes back to one of the original conversations that I had, is that cybersecurity practices in the humanitarian sector need to be really tight, because that data is very valuable to the malicious actors who may want it. So I think there was just a couple of points I wanted to pick up on that. Saying thanks, Hannah, sorry to interrupt, and you may continue.
Yeah, sure.
Just want to elaborate a little bit on your last point about consent forms and people don't know what they're signing. Also, it's an illusion of a choice. They don't really have a choice. If it's okay, you have to sign this consent form for us to take your data or you won't get food, then they don't really have a choice. And I think that this is something that we need to be reflecting on as well.
Absolutely, 100% agreed. Privacy. And also, I think there's an attitude to that too. There is an attitude that goes with it that if you don't want to disclose your personalised data in any way, that you're trying to hide something and that there's something wrong with you. And I think that attitude needs to go as well, because everybody has a different view and a different feeling and a different emotion about their privacy. I'll give you an example of myself, actually. My identity was stolen about 12, 15 years ago. There happens to be 2 Lisa Gay shorts in Australia, and 2 credit records were merged, and I found out about it inadvertently, and my identity had been stolen. So I'm very, very, very particular about my data. I'm very particular about who I identify as. For example, you know, even the way some of the forms make us identify ourselves. And I get really annoyed when I get a drop-down menu that says Mr., Ms., Mrs. or Miss. And I'm not any of those. But I don't get an option. So I think when you're talking consent and we're talking data, we have to make sure that we give everybody the options to, one, identify as they choose, but also choose not to without any discriminatory attitudes and perceptions that we're doing something wrong or hiding it. It's just we all have different viewpoints. So really good question.
Sorry, Lisa, my bad. I didn't realize we have an extra half an hour for whoever is willing to stay.
Yeah, we've got an extra half an hour, so we can continue to take some questions.
Yeah. Sorry about that. So going back to our group work. So as I mentioned during my presentation, database is all about, it's not all about the data we put in, but it does make a difference. So we agreed in our group that bad data leads to poor results and as such to poor decisions. So we need to be very careful and very clear with our enumerators when we design our questionnaires, when we collect data for any reason, to make sure that there is clarity over what we are actually asking for, how the data is going to be used, and what are the expected outcomes. Because actually we should start from the last so we can go to the design phase. Then someone talked about archiving and the digitalization of data. I think there is probably a gap in SOPs for most of the NGOs that we work with. It was mentioned that there is lack of clarity. Should we keep the data for 1 year, for 2 years, for 5 years? What is the legal framework probably that we have to follow, and how can we actually achieve that? Then going back to what we call relationship with data. So that's again about the understanding that we have about our own personal data. So there is a big difference, and I talked about before, between our understanding and someone who is in Mali, in an IDP camp, and you have the enumerator asking a bunch of questions, but they don't really understand what they're giving up. So how do we make sure that we educate community leaders and community members to the extent that this is possible? Now, Trevor, I think I like he was cynical. He's gone now, but I think he had some great ideas. So he asked the question, why we're not using open source software? I understood that he's probably tech savvy, so he knows about these things. Because open source software is probably closer to our ethics as NGOs. So why do we have to use like Microsoft as a default when you can actually use like Linux? And again, he did say that is not probably the solution at the individual level, but maybe at organizational level, we should try find solutions out of the box whereby the business model is not linking data to profit. And that's a big one. Then we talked about encrypted messages. So the use of cryptography, I think it's so common nowadays. We're using a Signal, we're using WhatsApp, Viber. There are so many apps. There was a suggestion that NGOs should use cryptography also for their emails. Actually, I was impressed when I was in Ethiopia because World Vision does have a system like that, and I would receive like highly sensitive information from their country director through an encrypted platform, which I had never seen before, and I found it fascinating. Lastly, an example, very topical. It's happening as we speak in the UK. It's about linking Ukrainian refugees to individuals through Facebook. So we did say, yes, you have a brilliant platform there, millions of you, brilliant, okay, take it with a pinch of salt, but whatever you think about Facebook. But the technology is there, it's the application that is the problem. So they use Facebook to link individuals with refugees coming from Ukraine. There's a whole bunch of concerns about protection, unaccompanied minors, vulnerable women, and what can we do to address some of these concerns? Have I missed anything? No? All right. So yeah, Lisa or David or anybody, any reflections there?
Yeah, I'm actually just going to talk about Facebook actually in some of the vulnerabilities that we have there, because we do use it widespread. And bear in mind, of course, in some nations like China, you know, they are banned, but they also do have WeChat and an equivalent, you know, state-based software. But I think there's some important points, and again, it comes back to my point before about misinformation and disinformation and fearing technology rather than embracing it and what we can do. When we're talking about Facebook, there's a couple of things in that. One, we all love to hate it because it's made a lot of money, but we also love to use it because can you imagine the last 2 years or the 3 years, or as I said, the times that we've used it, that it has done far more good than harm. I'm not saying it's perfect in any way, shape or form, but if we look at the challenges, and this is where as communities and as a net group of individuals, such as the humanitarian sector, we can actually engender change and curate change here, because some of the things that we can do is we can actually start to use the other technologies for data that is actually submitted to blockchain, to the Facebook, using some of the technologies such as blockchain. So for example, we can remove false profiles if we have to ensure that in the background, we have to identify ourselves before we can create a profile. That means it gets rid of a lot of our malicious actors and harmful actors out of the back. Now, yes, there does need to be some more push to encourage the big free platforms to utilize some of these technologies. But I'd flip it around and say, whilst ever we complain about it and we still use it, we aren't actually making change. We're just being complacent about it. So I always say there's an action that needs to be taken. And sometimes we don't like to think about that, you know, sometimes we're complicit in the uses of these. But I think these are good technologies, by the way. It's how we use them that is not necessarily correct. But there is opportunity for change, and there is ways that we can limit the harm that we can cause by using these technologies. And again, I'm going to say it comes down to education. So you can choose preferences, particularly on the new smartphones and things. There's lots of preference changes that you can use. But in fact, most people don't even know that those preferences exist or how to use them. You know, I found the other day, somebody told me something about, you know, when I shake my phone or I touch this bit on the back, you know, it turns the camera on and all sorts of other stuff. And I work in tech, you know, I didn't know that either. So we only know what we know, but we don't know what we don't know. So I think education, again, is key. Now, there's an important point to this. When we're often talking about technology, we actually need to embrace diversity in the conversation around technology, because the very young are digitally native. We aren't. They will know things that we don't. So we need to make sure when we are talking technology and options that we actually go out to seek the information we might need from those to where it's intuitive, and seek assistance in that regard, and then go, wow, well, I didn't know that, and create your education tools around what the gaps were and what's missing, because what you might think is simple, somebody who's not technically intuitive won't know. And so it's really important that we engage, you know, across ages and generational changes when we're actually talking about the development of technologies and understanding them. But don't fear these things, and I think that's important as well. And set your processes and conditions around using these technologies, because they are powerful. And I often do say, you know, could you have imagined the last 2 years without Facebooks and, you know, WhatsApp and all the messaging things and all the services and tools that we have? So, you know, the work for the greater good, we sometimes have to balance out with some work around mediating our thoughts and our opinions, because we all love to hate those who've been successful. So I'm not saying they're perfect in any way, shape or form, but I'm just saying we just need to moderate our thinking and see how we can actually utilize these tools and changes. And again, for a very small cost, if you use paid applications as opposed to free applications in the services and organisations, I'm not saying necessarily our customers have the financial capacity to do that, but we may be able to. We can limit our challenges. So it's a big conversation to have, but, you know, really important one.
Thank you, Lisa. Maybe just to say one point that I just remembered that it was mentioned by, I think again by Trevor during our conversation, the group work, and the responsibility of the sector. So he brought up the example of Nigeria, which is the largest a country in Africa. And the millions of young people who are technologically aware, very skilled, very capable, but yet again, we go with our own ideas, with the Western products, and he was trying to link the capacity of the local workforce with the possibility to walk through open source software. So we do have a responsibility to explore other avenues if we're true to the cause. And maybe either we are too lazy or we're just, it's not really a priority, or there's no incentive. There's no one chasing us to actually pursue this avenue. And before maybe we open again the floor, what's your thinking?
Panos, can I just pick up on that point in terms of Africa, which is really important, and also some of the emerging nations in the Asian region as well. The conversation about being digitally native is critically important for youth there, because one of the areas, particularly in Africa, so I'm talking Nigeria, Nigeria has a huge issue with corruption and fraud. In fact, it's 144th out of 180 in the world in terms of levels of corruption. And it's one of the reasons that blockchain technologies and cryptocurrencies and digital assets have been so powerfully strong in those areas. And that's because those youth and people have grown up only knowing fraud and corruption. And they've learned very quickly that the benefits of blockchain, for example, are evidentiary trails, peer-to-peer transactions, reducing fraud and corruption and so forth. So they've actually had a massive uptake, and also that they can control their wealth because the government controls the poor value of the naira in Nigeria. So there's been a huge uptake of digital assets and digital currencies there. They actually have much more knowledge about those things and the reasons why they're so valuable, because of the communities that they live and work and play in. And it's the same in the APAC region. And interestingly enough, in some of the countries where we've got issues around about women and the inequity for women, we found that digital wallets have also increased massively and given women access to resources they could never have before. And that's because traditional financial institutions require a man to sign off on an account, whereas a digital wallet for digital currencies does not. It depends on you personally and your identity, and you can actually keep that pseudonymous and so forth. So it's actually empowered so many women. In fact, often when I do my work with UN Women and the Commission for the Status of Women, people will say, well, what can we do? And we said the best thing you can do is give every woman on this planet a digital phone, a phone or a digital device, so they can actually access resources. So there's some really strong, powerful conversations about the disadvantages, but there's also some really strong ones about the advantages there as well. And what we also don't know even about connectivity is there's devices out there that work offline and on a different system to the internet. So some really great use cases and thought processes going into this question. It's really good.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. Right, we've covered an awful lot of ground. We started off with that bit by bit report, and we looked at the three sort of areas of focus. The first of all, focusing on the mission. What do we actually need to achieve? Then thinking about how we value the technology itself, and then of course looking at don't forget the people in that. We've done some group work together. We've raised a lot of issues. Let's open the floor now. What are your thoughts, reflections on any of these? Are there questions that you want to ask us or ask anybody else in the room, having been around there? What are your thoughts of what still needs to be resolved for our sector in the working in the humanitarian sector in security? That's the tricky one. If you don't say anything, I might start with a question. But I'll give you the opportunity first. I'm going to just therefore go back to Lisa and just ask one little bit about the backup. At the end of our bit, we became a group discussion. We became very focused on the fact that sometimes the systems aren't there, and sometimes there are complete crashes. And how can we actually build our resilience? How can we build our business continuity? I think we talked a lot about actually the need to prepare staff, to train staff, to ensure that they've got those common sense approaches that we need in order to cope with situations where the tech doesn't always work. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, look, absolutely. I'll give you a good example, a couple of good examples. So the one where the hack the Kaseya hack that was made in Europe, and it affected supermarkets and so forth all around the world and what have you, was a malicious actor. They overloaded the system, and so it shut everything down. And perfect example of supermarkets that can't operate and function. But I can give you a more basic example. My daughter heads up the accident emergency and is director of nursing of the second biggest hospital in the UK. And they communicate between the emergency department and the ambulance service using WhatsApp. And as you might know, that's owned by Facebook. And about 3 months ago, Facebook had a 6-hour outage. So the emergency department couldn't speak to the ambulance officers to know what patients they had coming in. And that was their method and route of communication. And that came about because there was this false information that was out there and perception that people were going to use their private phones and data was going to be transmitted on private phones. And so they didn't have a backup. So they just didn't have a backup. They didn't have a backup plan. And there's many, many case examples. You know, you're going to go into areas where, one, if it's been a natural disaster, there may not be power, they can't charge devices, you can't get digital transactions. So I think absolutely technology is only as good as the people using it. And each of us has to be able to be educated with what if it goes wrong? What if it doesn't work? What's my plan A, plan B, plan C if it all goes wrong? And that to me comes down to, there's a couple of elements to this. Our attitude to risk management has been quite profound over the years. We've organisations, and I spoke about this at the person-centred approach one, because of the fallout to organisations, reputationally, financially, economically, and all of that sort of thing, organisations have tended to want to control everything. And it is like risk managers is more about controlling any contingency that might harm or have an outcome that we don't want to happen. And we create checklists of everything, that this is the prescriptive way that you must do it. We've sort of lost our way a little bit in risk management, and I've worked a lot in high-risk industries where we actually do educate people to have a sense of perception and also what I would say situational awareness on every task that we do. And in fact, in the mining industry, we call it Take 5. And that means just taking 5 minutes to have a look around, see what's happening, what is the situation I'm in, what's going to happen, and have some sort of sense of common sense. I think the person-centred approach to security risk management is a good way heading back to some form of common sense approach where we have to give individuals an ability to be able to be agile and flexible in their approaches to that. But I think when we develop technology solutions and we're going to rely on them, we do have to have options A and B. Nothing like a piece of pen and paper when your computer doesn't work. I have myself been in presentations and conferences where the presenter just about goes cold when their PowerPoint presentation won't work. And I think you're an expert if you can't stand and speak for 20 minutes on your topic without having a slide behind you. There's a problem. I think this is all about prior preparation and making sure we do have backup plans, because technology, again, is only as good as the people using it. So I 100% agree. Fantastic when it works, woeful when it's not. Like if somebody took my phone, I would be lost for about an hour. Then I would go out in the garden and do some gardening or do something else. But no. I would have a backup. I would have a backup of everything. And I think there's an important point too. If they're critical systems, having backups, there's lots of technologies now which will work offline, and then they will re-upload information as soon as you go online. So you can still work locally on many technology platforms, but and then back it up, at a later point.
Okay, I was looking back. So I'd like to go back to what you said about we complain about social networks and then we still use them. I would argue that it's the same arguments that you gave, lady here, that it's a false choice. I mean, if the choice is either you separate yourself from society or you do, it's not a choice.
Look, in many ways you are correct. But I think we've got a bit of a challenge, and I always like just to be the fly in the ointment here, and I'm not saying either is right or wrong, is that I go back to the paid options, and I'll use LinkedIn as an example. You can actually, and Twitter, in fact, you can have a paid subscription to Twitter as well. It's only like $4 or something, $4 Australian dollars, so that's only £2 or something like that a month. But LinkedIn, there's professional versions. So for me, I view my LinkedIn profile as my professional profile. And so I have a paid version of LinkedIn. And that gives me a huge number of options in terms of my own personal security, because I like to manage my own personal security in my devices and various other things. But I think there's a perception, and this is interesting, there's a perception in the digital world that because you're not really there, it's free. We have a free mentality when it comes to a lot of digitization, and we talk about, you know, open source software and all of those sorts of things. I need to throw it back and say, well, that's okay, but somewhere along the line, the world actually does need to generate a revenue and income, because it actually makes the world go round. It needs to be equitable and all of that. I get that very much so, and everybody knows that I work in that space. But we also have to moderate our viewpoint that everything that's free has to be paid for somewhere. So we have to get back to a bit of a level playing field to think about our mentality around free services that we continue to use, e.g. messaging apps. We can use WhatsApp and we can use Messenger and so forth. But there is a paid one called Threema, THREEMA, which I use. It is the most secure. It's used at military grade, but it's $4 a year. And for that, no one gets your data. And so we do actually sometimes have options, but we all look for the completely free option because that's our mentality. It's like, you know, during COVID, and we all started hopping into Zoom meetings and what have you. We're all happy to use Zoom, the free version. Not many people wanted to actually use the paid subscription version, which gave you other options. I'm not saying everybody can afford to, but we do need to look at ourselves inwardly and say, well, where in this ecosystem are we accountable for our own actions as well as the others? And I think you are actually correct in the sense that because of the digital transformation we have, to not use these platforms means we increase the digital divide. I mean, again, fly in the ointment. You can go to somewhere like China and you've got a mandatory app like WeChat, but every piece of data is tracked. So we've got to get to a happy medium. And I think there's a lot of work to be done on knowing what and how data can be harmful, what is personalized and so forth. So it's a really big question. I like to throw in another 2 points. At the moment, and this is some of the work that I'm doing, at the moment, we also have 2 very vast groups who are being excluded, the very young and the older person, particularly with the increase of dementia and aging. Because if we are to completely engage in the digital world, how do those groups actually securely access that digital world when they don't have the facilities for, you know, passwords and so forth? So there's a lot of work to be done in identity and access.
Yes, when you mentioned the paid version, I'm sure it is great, and it's actually Swiss, and I'm Swiss. It's great, but the problem is the volume that the free version offers. Just beats it all, because then the winner takes it all kind of situation is happening in the digital world, and that's the whole monopoly issues that are happening. It's because of that. It's because of the volume. So it's still, the paying version is not really a full choice that we would have. Sorry.
No, that's great. I think we might start to draw things to a close, because we're running out of time and it's lunchtime. So I'm going to ask Panos to wrap up, if that's all right. Yep. Over to you, sir.
Yep. Okay, I'm going to stand up. I'm going to use a very plain language, okay, just to summarize what we went through. So to begin with, so David said, don't get too excited with fancy technologies. Some of the best solutions are low-tech solutions, especially for small NGOs that can't afford major investment. So the solution might be just in front of you. You just need to look for it, probably a little bit better. And obviously, the underlying message from David was stay true to the mission, be mission-oriented, and have the mission driving your decisions. Then Lisa said that the journey to technology can be steep and scary. You're not alone out there. It's the same for everybody. Be fit for purpose. Technology has to work for everybody, and it's not about the process, it's about the people. She also said that the role of education is critical to bring to bridge the digital divide and bring people closer to each other. If you don't understand technology, you can't participate, you can't engage. And that's the reason why we have to keep trying to educate the communities we work with when we actually use new technologies and innovations. Simplification of terms. So very often we come across fancy new acronyms or terms that we're not very familiar with. Let's try to break them down to simple messages and make sure that everybody understands what's behind that particular term. Just two last points. You had a slide about facts versus fiction, and I think you tried to demystify some of the risks. So we do have the perception that some of the new technologies may lead to significant risks. Maybe it's all about mitigating the risks and not really being risk averse. And I think the last message from you, Lisa, was about education, accessibility, and assessment, risk assessment, I guess. Is that correct? Yes.
That's correct, yes.
So I hope I haven't missed anything else. Then it was my turn. So I just brought down the conversation to a different level. I gave you 4 examples of technologies from the SRM sector that they're great, they're brilliant, but if we don't take into account the people perspective, if we're not like people-centric, we can run into a number of issues. And just to conclude, I'm going to link this session to the overall objective of the Humanitarian Network and Partnerships Week. I talked about at the beginning. It's all about continuing this conversation in the months to come. So it's not a one-off session. So we're going to take the findings from the group work and some of the ideas that were discussed. And as GISF, we'll try to see what is relevant for our members and move this conversation forward. So when we come back next year, maybe we can continue this conversation. We can build some research or something which is relevant for our members and make sure that we don't leave that behind and move to the next big thing. So I think it's something that is going to stay with us for a couple of years. So I think it deserves our attention. And with that, David, I'll give you back the microphone.
Okie dokie. I think that's us done. Thank you so much for joining us for these 2 hours. We're hoping that the conversation will continue. If there is anything that you want to follow up with any of us, well, you can find us on LinkedIn, the free version. We're all there. So please do contact us there, chat to us afterwards. If you came in a little bit later, and that's absolutely fine, do let Megan know that you came and who you are, because it's really useful for GISF to keep your data and use it safely and responsibly so that they know who's actually come to the sessions. Am I right? Absolutely. Okay. Thank you, everybody. That's been a really, really interesting couple of hours. Thank you, Lisa. Sorry you couldn't be with us in person.
My pleasure, everyone. Thank you.
The people doing the world's most important work are up against the biggest challenges. Since the 90s, security incidents involving NGOs have increased as their independence and impartiality no longer protect them. Humanitarians are actively targeted, as well as exposed to the risks of conflict and disaster, facing kidnapping, injury, and death in order to help those in need. And the threats to their safety means their ability to help diminishes too. NGOs began to create roles for dedicated security professionals, but they often lacked support and resources and worked in isolation. In 2006, a group of them from the UK and Ireland got together to develop coherent approaches to security risk management in the humanitarian space, eventually becoming an established network, the European Interagency Security Forum. With a strategic, inclusive and collaborative focus, the Forum has created a centre of excellence, facilitates a peer-to-peer network, builds capacity for security risk management, and provides a voice for practitioners, reaching over 100 members. In response to growing demand, it has now gone global, bringing different perspectives, expertise and resources to make core activities such as original research, trainings, workshops, and knowledge sharing more impactful than ever. As a result, organizations are able to build their security risk management on an even stronger foundation to keep more aid workers safe and enable sustainable access to communities in need. With a vision to see the work of the whole third sector done more effectively by supporting NGOs around the world, we are the Global Interagency Security Forum.